Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the St Mary's Homeboys, good evening, and thank you all very much for coming to the Daleside for the second and final talk relating to our time at the home in Filler Village. At night, when all the world was asleep, the question ran so deep: who am I? Who are we? Who are we, homeboys? Well, I was number 64.
I just couldn't sit silent and let people believe that everyone was liars.
Yeah.
All have horror stories of their time at St Mary's.
He hit this lad on the legs, and as the cane went down and came up, the skin actually came off his bone, in other words, and stuck to the cane and came off.
Yeah. The biggest scar on my life from there was the violent one.
There was also sexual abuse.
He used to come around the dormitories and pick who he wanted. And what he used to say is, I'm doing a medical.
On arrival at the home, and on countless occasions over the years, the nuns and their helpers actually gave us their version of why we were there. We were devil children, nobody loved us, nobody cared for us, nobody wanted us. The Sisters of Mercy showed not, and indeed, we used to call them Sisters of No Mercy.
The amount of times they beat me, you know, and I thought, you know, they're going to end up killing me one day. And they come close to it, but they didn't succeed. And I'm glad I'm here with you today, Brian. I know you've been through all this yourself. And it's, look, I've got scars all over where I've attempted suicide. I took overdoses. I just didn't have anything to live for.
It took me about 20 years to actually recover from my experience of St Mary's. I was 4 years old when I first went in there. I had two brothers like Brian and a sister who was taken to the girls' orphanage in Darlington, St Joseph's. My mother had committed suicide, that's why we were taken in there. We two older brothers were immediately taken away into different age groups, as we were all split up into different groups. And I was left on my own and I was crying. And this nun says, "Stop your crying and come along with me." And I was inconsolable. And she says, "If you don't stop your crying, I'll give you something to cry for."
I was 16 when I attempted to take my life. My brother John hung himself at the age of 16, and my brother Fred gassed himself at the age. My brother Fred gassed himself at the age of 21, and I had to identify his body, and I was then age 19. How? I mean, what a tragic, absolute waste of human life. How does all this happen? And now maybe people have a better idea. How messed up you can get when these sort of things happen and you haven't got a family behind you at that point in time. It's indescribable, really, sometimes, the pain.
I think it was akin to an organised, authorised criminal organisation.
You mean the whole himself?
Well, I mean, the fact that there were many acts of violence against children on a daily basis. I was in the orphanage for 13 years, so you can imagine the effect it had on us. And I was just one of hundreds.
I seem to remember it was a black lad, and something had obviously gone wrong, and we were encouraged to sort of slap him round a bit, if you want to put it that way.
Beat each other up.
Yeah, till he sort of started crying or felt really upset. And then a few days later, that would be somebody else's turn to do that.
That's right.
And then a few days later, it would be my turn.
Peter stayed at St Mary's 3 times. He believes he buried his memories of abuse to survive.
I still find that when you come back, the memories, you lie awake at night and the memories start coming back to you and you start thinking, well, why? I mean, our grandchildren, I've got one of 5, which I think is one of the first times I went in, and they look at you with such love in their eyes and trust. And you think, well, we were that age when we went in there, and they did that to us. It just doesn't compute, basically.
In the home we were told many things. To be pure of mind, to tell the truth, etc. And yet by examples of behaviour we witnessed and the treatment we received, we were also taught how to be deceitful, how to lie. And none could give a child a beating and yet smile unperturbed. Out in the public, minutes later at church or walking, would pat the same child on the head. We learned how to be violent, how to fight, and how to bully. We learned how to survive, how to be a lone survivor, as friendships were prevented and also forbidden. Why it had to be like that, I don't know. I can only suppose that the aim was to break our spirits. At a very early age, I came to hate authority. We were forever being punished for doing nothing wrong. Some nuns and elders, on a daily basis, would just strike you as they walked past you. If you were brave enough to ask why they'd done it, the answer was always the same. That's for when you do something. They seem to get great pleasure out of this, sometimes smiling as they hit us.
Another thing that they said, I was crying for me mum. I was asking for me mum. It was only days after my mum had committed suicide. I had no idea that she'd died, or so I was still looking for me mum, if you like. And this nun said to me, she says, "Do you know your mum committed a mortal sin? And you know what happens to people who commit mortal sins?" Well, at the time I didn't. But later on, when I went to St. Charles's and I learned the catechism, and I found out what mortal sin meant, and basically what this nun was saying to me was that my mother was burning in hell.
In the orphanage there were a few incredibly kind people, but those kind people still knew what was happening by virtue of the fact it was a minute, hourly, daily routine to be savaged. But, having said that, I'm not defending these people. There's two wonderful ladies, Miss Pat and Miss Josephine, who actually tried to bring love into the place. And we saw firsthand how often they would be pressurised and bullied by the monsters. And so what could they have done? They couldn't have changed anything overnight. So some of them did try, and it was a risky thing to do. And part of that risk was, it might sound a bit petty, when the good ones had to sit and eat with the bad ones, that's when they would really pick on them. And the squabbling or in the restroom, and it became evident that these two, Miss Pat and Miss Josephine particularly, who tried to give us love, show us love, were under immense pressure not to do it. Now that must have been difficult for them. So everybody in that orphanage, as adults, knew what was going on. And some people could not have done anything about that. Report what? To who? What would happen? Make it worse for themselves, make it worse for us. It was a bizarre, complete bizarre situation to be in. Back then, if homeboys were stupid enough to complain to anybody outside of the orphanage of what was going on, a number of things would happen. The top thing being that that homeboy would be beaten up severely when he got back, because somebody quite innocently, your mum, your auntie, could have said, "I need to ask about that because that's dreadful," or "I'm going to report that to the police because that's criminal." That would have got back to the orphanage, and that boy or boys who had spoken to the adults would have been flogged. So you did us all a favour. If anybody knew about it and you didn't report it, well, you did, in a sense. It was the wrong, right thing to do.
It's only recently he's told me about the awful cruelties, getting shut in a room by himself when he was just a little boy and being left to scream and cry all night. It just makes me cry thinking about it. I find it just so distressing.
But these children had no protection. They weren't just being clipped around the ear or smacked or having a stick across their bottom. They were being brutalised and probably in some cases raped, and terrible, terrible things. And the priest had to know what was happening. I
turned my back on the Catholic Church completely, and my back is still turned completely onto the Catholic Church. Now, that's not to say I hate them, I've any wishes of harm or anything to him at all. It's just for what happened to me and what I hear it happen to other people, I just can't rationalise it with myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to speak of another absent homeboy. His name is John Storey. John made national and international headlines back in the very good years of the 60s, 1967 to be precise. John and I were at St Mary's Home since babies, and left when we were 16. At 17-ish, we joined the army, enlisted into the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers. At the age of 20, we were both dispatched overseas to the Middle East, on active service to a place called Aden. Our tour of duty was to last about 9 months. On the 20th of June 1967, John Storey was a voluntary member of a mobile patrol in Crater. This two-vehicle mobile patrol, which John was part of, came under a ferocious attack by terrorists using rifles and machine guns. Of the 13 soldiers ambushed in that incident, only one survived. That survivor was John Storey.
It was a different day for me because it was my day off. I was a bit bored. I was leaning on the balcony. When the Land Rovers pulled up and some of the guys jumped in, they said, "Do I want to come along?" I said, "I'd love to." We must have been doing 50 miles an hour. And as we approached the barracks, the machine guns up. There must have been 200 or 300 people shooting.
So here we have a former homeboy who survived St Mary's Orphanage, joined the army, went on active service, and survived a remarkable incident, I think you'll agree. Some 10 years after that incident, he was invited by a newspaper to express his feelings or relive that moment, and he did so. And in the telling of the story to this particular newspaper, he described that part of his survival strategy or strength or determination was because of the brutality, the violence, and the extremeness of his life at St Mary's Orphanage. The point I'm trying to make here is that having survived the orphanage, having survived the Aden campaign, this individual merely spoke his mind, and his mind was honest. And yet, he couldn't be accepted for that. The response from the Catholic Church authorities was minimum and reactive all through the ordeal of the exposure, as told by us homeboys. Our letter and supporting evidence sent to the Vatican took 5 months to get a response, which came from a senior minister, Archbishop Antonio Menini, whose office is in London. Our reply to that letter from London on the 9th of June was still unanswered, so that's 7 months ago and counting.
The church, like a lot of other organisations, and again, I'm not making any excuses for the church, we didn't get it right in the past. Right. We didn't. Some of the things the homeboys have spoken about, in the time, nobody was very good at listening to children. We didn't believe often what children said, especially if there were things that we thought that could never have happened. We've done a lot of work with this case, if we want to call it that, trying to trace people, trying to put things into context, trying to put people's lives in context and get some of the pieces of that jigsaw for them.
And are the church prepared to take this on board? Do they listen to you properly with this?
I'd like
or
to think so.
Or are they reluctant to accept that this has happened?
I don't think they're reluctant to accept that it's happened, because we've seen a number of cases. I've been involved in a number of cases in the last 9 years where priests have served prison sentences because of abuse that's happened historically. I would say 90% of my work is looking at, and it's not a term that sits comfortably with me, but historic disclosures. The fact that they're historic doesn't make them any less serious, because what we see is often a lifelong impact of the harm that somebody has suffered historically.
Institutional cruelty was widespread back in those days. I mean, it wasn't just, if it was St Mary's, we could all put our hands up again and say, okay, fine. We got the bad look of the draw, we got the bad ones, but everybody else was all right. But when you talk to people more and more, when you read things more and more, it was institutional. It seemed to be almost every home that you went into that these nasty people were there. Now, I often wonder, well, if they do nasty things to us, what was nastily done to them? Were they just naturally bad people, or were they actually just sort of institutionalised themselves? And that was the way that the Catholic Church wanted people like us to be treated. I guess, again, we'll never know the answer to that.
The times we had there, etched on our bodies and our minds, we'll never ever forget them. We've never ever had an apology from any of the nuns. We've had many male hierarchy, priests, other male people from the Catholic Church who come forward and says, well, this may have happened and we're very sorry, it shouldn't have happened. But we've never ever once had any of the nuns who were the main perpetrators of the abuse come forward and apologise and try to give us some explanation as to why they treated us like that.
They did actually get information regarding 3 of the main monsters, all of whom went back to Ireland, one of whom, under doctor's advice, when the police wanted to interview, was told by the doctor that she was too frail to be interviewed. One of the other ones, probably the biggest monster that I remember, couldn't remember anything about St Mary's, and the other one was dead. Well, it didn't bother me, to be honest with you, I didn't enjoy it, but I got some kind of, I don't know if the word is satisfaction, some relief that they got a knock on the door. And just maybe that the last thoughts before they pass away and go to heaven, of course, they'll have the homeboys in their minds. They will remember, so I'm pretty damn sure about that. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of St Mary's Homeboys, good night, God bless, and everybody stay safe. Thank you.
And at the 12-13 station of the cross, the Lord was taken down and all that kind of stuff. And it was quite tedious and didn't really mean a fat lot, I have to say. Although, when you look and you see anybody in that state, you can't help but feel sorry for him. And he's got what looks like mothers and people wanting to help him. But sadly, there weren't anybody helping us. But he got the help that we needed. We needed to be taken off this cross that we were on, and it didn't happen, I'm afraid.